In this video, I'm going to explain how other people told me I was autistic before I had a formal diagnosis. In my first assessment a couple weeks ago, and then I had a follow-up, a second assessment, or the second part to the assessment last week, and then this week on Thursday I'll get the full diagnosis. But I just know I'm autistic. And here's how I knew. Okay, so we're gonna start in childhood. Ever since I was a little kid, I knew that something was a little off. While editing, I realized one thing that also kind of made me feel like I had autism as a kid or something. So as a kid, I was habitually ashy all of the time. I hated the practice of putting on lotion. I thought it was too tedious because in my mind, I thought you could only lotion the right hand, right leg, left hand, left leg. So I would put lotion on this hand and thought I only could lotion that. And it was like a lot of work. Put lotion on the right hand, only lotion on the right hand. So I just didn't put on lotion because I thought that was too much work. Until one day it dawned on me and I went like this. And I realized that you could lotion your legs with both hands. And I didn't come to that realization until I was past the age of 12, honestly. So the signs were there with my behavior. And I'm not saying off in a negative way. It's just in observing other children and observing how certain people reacted to me and my behaviors. It was night and day, especially in relation to a sibling of mine who's 13 months younger than me. I initially didn't go to preschool to start. So before I went to preschool, I stayed with a relative, an older relative in my family on my mom's side, in a senior housing facility with my younger sister. And then when it was time to go to preschool, they decided to push us both together so that we can go together. But I remember the daycare and I remember the exact day. When we got there, I was very overwhelmed. It was just a lot of noise, a lot of colors, a lot of toys laying everywhere. I could literally see it. And I just didn't do well to the adjustment. So they let her go first. And then I ended up staying or continuing to stay with the relative in the senior housing facility until I was ready to go into preschool and then matriculate through school. From then, there were little things, especially in school. That's where I noticed it the most, especially with tests. Again, I didn't know what autism or ADHD was, but there were things that I would do to self-accommodate. For example, when we would take tests, I remember in kindergarten, we had the MCAS, which is a standardized test. And I remember sitting at the desk and reading the questions out loud. And it was an English portion, English section. And I remember the sentence said, "The horse jumped over the stable," or something. But I remember reading it out loud. And my teacher coming up to me and saying, "Dasia, you can't read the questions out loud. You have to read it in your head." So I had to learn how to accommodate in that way. Like, even now, post-grad school, post a master's program, and taking my MFT exam, the accommodation that I asked for was being able to read the questions out loud because I need to not only see what you're saying, but hear what you're saying. If I'm just hearing it, I'm not hearing it. So I need to have multiple inputs to really understand what you're saying. So that's one thing. I would constantly get up and walk around, but because I was a good kid, throughout school, there was leeway to these behaviors, and they thought I was just being helpful, but really I just needed to get up and move. I remember in kindergarten, this was a substitute teacher. I was shuffling. This was when the oar shuffle from what is that show? Dragon Tales was out. I was like really obsessed with that. And I was obsessed with Cassie from Dragon Tales. But I remember to transition from one spot to the next, I was doing the aura shuffle, but I was doing it really slowly, and it was a black teacher. And she was like, Dasia, what are you doing? And I said, I'm doing the aura shuffle. And she said, aura shuffle, you're behind to the rug. I literally remember that. So even as a kid, there were things that I did that were out of the ordinary, but I was also extraordinary in terms of the knowledge that I possessed at such a young age. I was able to do things that my peers weren't able to do. And also, I wouldn't say I was more advanced, but I was reading higher level books. I was spelling, math is where the difficulty came in. And during the assessment, I'll go into more detail in a separate video about what the assessment was like. But during the assessment, he asked me, did I have difficulty? And I remembered that, I don't know why it does that. I remembered that around the time that I transitioned from kindergarten to first grade, or no, like a little fourth, it was either fourth or fifth grade, third, fourth, or fifth grade, I started to develop a stutter, primarily when asked to read out loud. So much so that they put me in this program called Read Naturally. And I wrote about this in my blog, about my experience in being in Read Naturally, and how I was so adamant about not being in this program that I induced a fake rash on my hand. So much so that just to show that I didn't want to be in the program. But I had to join Read Naturally because of a stutter that I had. But I was reading advanced level books. I really loved reading. I love story time, especially when the teacher would read. I remember she read books like Hugo Cabret, The Lightning Thief. I remember, like, she would be sitting here and I would be sitting here because I just enjoy the experience of books and reading. And after I did the Read Naturally program, my stutter did improve. And in adolescence, just throughout the course of my life, I didn't really have many friends. I told the instructor that I inherited a lot of my friends, or like I was grandfathered in for a lot of my friends through church and also through my siblings. So I've never had to make a friend in my entire life. People just come to me and say that we're friends, or they're friends with my siblings. And then all of a sudden, because we hang around each other for so long, we become friends, or they start off friends with my sibling or siblings, and then they just stick to me, and then they bounce back to the sibling. But yeah, I've never had to make a friend in my entire life. And that was another question he asked me. He asked me, how do I know when somebody wants to be my friend or when somebody is my friend? And I didn't really know how to answer that. But I answered, they tell me. Or he asked me, why do you think people get into relationships? And my response was to procreate. But then I cleaned it up and said, like, oh, they want companionship, relationship, yada, yada, yada. But yeah, through adolescence, I didn't really share similar interests of people my age. I mainly hung out with people significantly younger than me or significantly older than me. Primarily older people. He asked me what was the television that I watched. And when I was a kid, I watched adult television. I watched Nick at Night. I watched Mad TV, Adult Swim. My favorite show was South Park. So I didn't really have the same interests as my peers, but I would try to watch the same things that they were watching so that I could relate to them. For example, my cousins would watch Degrassi, so I would watch Degrassi because I assumed that would make me more, I guess, palatable to people my age or relatable to people my age, because I would often notice for some people there was like a disconnect, and I was also very quiet, severely quiet, because I didn't really like talking and I didn't like people talking to me unless we shared similarities. Like my best friend, I had one best friend. And we were very similar. We shared the same humor. But she was more extroverted, I was more introverted, so it worked out because she did most of the talking. Now, shifting to grad school, prior to, again, I mentioned different things that I would do to self-accommodate. So I mentioned MCAS. During MCAS is a standardized test, and it lasts the whole day. We would have pep rallies to prepare for sitting the whole entire day. And I knew this, but I didn't really understand how I was self-accommodating or why I felt the need to self-accommodate. And how I self-accommodated was, during MCAS, you were allowed to bring things that would help you focus. So you could bring a pillow, you could bring a blanket, so when you're finished, you can have time to just like relax and decompress. But you have to get to that point, to the relaxing and decompressing. And in MCAS, you're in a classroom, you're sitting at your desk, you get 2 pencils, 2 number 2 pencils, you get a booklet, and the teacher is your proctor, and they pretty much read from a script. And there's different sections. There's the science section, the math section, and the English section, or ELA. I would always get advanced on the ELA. Math always needs improvement. Science, typically proficient. Never anything good for math. So for English, I would bust it out immediately because I knew I would get it done and I would do well. Science, okay, I'll do what I need to do. Math, when it came time to math, I knew I needed to focus. But I couldn't focus because, again, although we are required to be quiet, you still hear people writing. You hear the eraser. You hear people breathing. You hear people thinking. As crazy as that sounds, you literally hear people thinking. So it was extremely challenging for me to focus, right? So what I would do is, when it came time for the math section, I would take the book, put it in the middle of the desk, and I would just sit there for hours and hours until there was no one left in the classroom. Because once you finish your test completely, you are moved to a different classroom so that those left can focus. So what I would do is I would just wait for everybody else to finish so that I could take the time to focus on the questions at hand. And again, you're not allowed to read anything out loud. So I would wait for them to leave so I could at least mumble it under my breath or constantly repeat it so that I could understand what's being said to me. And I thought that was normal. Me sitting there for hours on end, waiting for other people to finish so they could leave. And eventually, teachers would notice that I would do this. And this is when they would be like, Dasia, you have to write. You have to focus. Or they would do the general announcement like, okay, guys, I know the test is very stressful, but make sure you're taking breaks and make sure you're jumping back in. I know we have all day to finish this, but it's really important that you really take the time out to take the test and really focus. Meanwhile, that's directed at me because I'm literally just sitting there. And I think in their mind, they think like, oh, she's not doing it. She's not taking it serious. Probably not, because I was a good kid. But they were just like, we got to get her back in. But they weren't realizing that I was taking it serious, but I was doing it on my terms and what was helpful for me. And there were other little things that I would do to self-accommodate. But because I didn't really see anything wrong with them, or it wasn't brought to my attention that there was anything wrong with it, it just became a part of my everyday routine. So when he asked me like, oh, do you do things? I had to think about, well, I do things, but I wouldn't really consider them peculiar. So for example, he asked me if I had routines. And I said, when I get home, I have to put my keys, my phone, my wallet in a specific bowl or I'll lose it. I have to wash my hands because I know at some point I'm going to go into the refrigerator and I don't want to go into the fridge with dirty hands. And I also take my shoes off prior to entering. And then I also explained that I have a system in terms of the cupboard. Everything of similarity has to be lumped together. and I have to see what it is so that way I don't forget that I have it and then keep buying the same thing over and over again. And then he said, well, do you feel like you have to see the labels? And I'm like, no, I don't care about the labels. I just need to know what it is. So I think he was assessing for OCD, but it's not like an obsessive compulsive thing. It's just so that I don't forget, or I'm very forgetful. For example, I thought I lost a card that I had because I forgot to put it back in my wallet. Turns out it was just in the coat pocket. But that happens often, or I'll go and do something. I'll get to the space where I need to be to do that thing, and then I'll forget why I got there. So then I have to regroup, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, I went in there to do this one thing, and then I remember. Or he also asked me, do I have struggles with money and paying bills? And I said no, because I have systems. So through self-accommodating and establishing said systems, there are areas where I have difficulties, but because I caught it early, or I had established systems early, I don't really have difficulties with the logistical components. It's the social components and the peer-to-peer interactions that I really struggle with. And that's also why I was insistent on getting a diagnosis, because I could have gone through my entire life without a diagnosis, if I'm being completely honest. Like, with the ADHD thing, I was like, okay, it's difficult, but it's manageable. But then I had posted something on TikTok. I posted a long time ago that I don't experience FOMO because I don't remember, but I just said I don't experience FOMO, and I explained why I don't experience FOMO in certain emotions. And somebody commented, that sounds like autism. And I was like, wait a minute, that word never was in my scope. It never crossed my mind. So that kind of opened my mind to the idea of, wait a minute, my quirks and behaviors, maybe more than quirks and behaviors, it could be autism. Like, that never crossed my mind. So that kind of put a bug in my ear. And then when I got to grad school, that put the battery in my back. So getting into grad school, I would say that's when things became somewhat difficult, more so from a social component, because I realized, or even in undergrad, there is an emphasis on networking and building connections. And I just found myself struggling with that, like connecting with my peers, making friends. I did make friends loosely, but it didn't go well. It didn't end well. And I found myself getting frustrated, not necessarily understanding why this keeps happening, or also where the struggles come from. So in grad school, obviously my degree was in clinical mental health counseling and marriage and family therapy. So I'm actively learning about the DSM, diagnosis, disorders, what constitutes a diagnosis or a DSM diagnosis, and it's clinically significant, or impairment that's clinically significant. It's considered a disorder if there is significant impairment in your day-to-day functioning, right? So we're learning about the different diagnoses, and we didn't really learn much about autism, but I had been doing my supplemental research, as I always do, and we were talking about trauma. And I had mentioned, one, that I wanted to be an equine assisted therapist because I like being outside. And talk therapy is great, but sometimes talk therapy is not what certain people need. And I felt like I needed something more. And in turn, I decided to do research. And I was explaining to my professor, Keanu Reeves, that in doing research, I learned that autism presents differently in Black girls, Black people, or people of color. And it's not because it's a different diagnosis, it's because it's diagnosed differently. For autism, a lot of autism studies were done on young white boys. So a lot of the behaviors that young black girls exhibit who are autistic are often overlooked due to overperforming, high achieving, perfectionism, cultural differences between either the test administrator and the client, or the client and the test administrator, and that's the same thing. But yes, bias is also pertinent in terms of how someone is diagnosed. Prejudice is also a factor to consider. So I'm reading up on this and I'm explaining to her that, yeah, I've been doing a lot of research on, and I meant to say ADHD, because at that time I was doing research on ADHD. So I was like, I'm doing a lot of research on ADHD, and I'd like to do more research on how autism presents in black girls. And I didn't mean to say autism, I meant to say ADHD. And for some reason with this particular professor, every change, every move that she made, I was able to identify it. She got tattoos on her arm and I was able to pick it up in a minute. She changed her nose ring from a stud to a hoop. And she came in one day and I looked at her and I was like, oh, you changed your nose ring. And she's like, whoa, how did you notice that? My partner didn't even notice that. She cut her hair and I noticed it. And I don't know why I was able to identify such shifts, like less than subtle shifts on her, but it was like freaky deaky. So when I said that, she like made a face. When I said I want to learn more about how autism presents in black girls, she like made a face. It wasn't a bad face, but it was a noticeable face. And I was like, that face was noted. I'm noting that face, because what does that mean? So I noted the face, and she was like, she also made it a point to share that CPTSD, which is complex post-traumatic stress disorder, also sometimes presents as autism. And I told her, she was like, oh, do you want me to explain more? And I was like, no, I'm not ready for that. Like, I just learned about autism and ADHD. I'm not, there's no capacity for any of that. So we put a pin in that, but I also made note of her face. And yeah, so I went about my life, but there were things, like I constantly had like 3 or 4 pairs of headphones on my person. I constantly had my headphones in. I was constantly reading books. I was pretty to myself, and that kind of rubbed other people the wrong way. And also this was another area that stood out to me. We were doing a group project. This was a simple project, not really worth much points or anything. Like it really wasn't worth anything. And this was one of the last classes during my grad school program. And I was in a group with my peers, but they were white. One of them was a white girl, older than me. We're sitting there and I ask her to use her markers, and I draw a brain. I draw it really well. Looks literally like a brain. They're like, whoa, you drew that really fast. Okay. So then I put her markers back in her container and I hand it to her. But it was the markers that have 2 sides. So there's the long tip side and the short tip side. But I had unintentionally organized them in order by tip in the container. So I handed her back her box, and she looks at me and she says, oh, did you notice that you put it all back in order? And I was like, no, I didn't notice that. I didn't do it on purpose. But keep in mind, she's talking to me in a baby voice. And that happens often. People see something on me, in me, and they just, what feels like infantilizing me, but they also do that for people with disabilities as well. ableist people do that. They infantilize the individual who they perceive as less than or weaker to some degree or incapable. So I just thought that was weird. When she started talking to me in a baby voice, I was like, what the hell is wrong with this girl? But again, noted. And there were other occurrences where I could tell that people wanted to be my friend, or they thought, wow, this girl is pretty, or this girl is this girl is that. I want to be next to this girl. I want to be associated with this girl. And they stick around long enough, and every one of them would make a face. And I really can't explain the face, but when I see it, I see it. And it's like a, but not as subtle, but it's like what's wrong with this girl? And honestly, when I first noticed it did hurt my feelings, because it's like, what am I doing that makes you make that face? Or what am I doing that causes pause? And after they make that face, they start treating me different. And let me see if I can make the face. So say we're talking for a little bit, and then I do something or say something that triggers something inside of them, and they go, but it's not as subtle. It's like it's quick, and I'm able to pick it up. And it's not of disgust. It's like confusion, but also, if I had to add some subtext, it's like, why are you acting like that? Or I wasn't expecting you to act like that. And that happens often, and that happened a lot in grad school. So prior to that, my youngest sister, would like make jokes. And by this time, I was kind of questioning if I was autistic, so I wanted to soft launch how people would react if I disclosed that I was autistic, prior to getting a diagnosis, by the way. So I texted my sister. I was like, hey, I think I'm autistic. And then she started making jokes. I'm not holding this against her, but she started making jokes like, when she would hit me or try to hit me, she'd be like, she said one time, oh, I don't want to hit you because I don't want to be a spectrum beater. Or what else did she say? We were helping my Nana clean out her room one time, and my Nana was a registered nurse, and she had a pamphlet that helped you diagnose children with autism, and it was a questionnaire. And my sister picked it up, the book, and she said, Dasia, you should take a look at this, or you should fill it out. And I was like, that's not funny, but I guess. So but she would also, like, she was on TikTok one time, and she sent me a video. She was watching a video on autism traits, and she was like, this sounds like you. But she wasn't being rude. She was like, yeah, I think you might be autistic. That also explains why you were able to draw so well as a kid. And I was like, what is the correlation? But I was able to draw, like, really well, like, freaky well. Like, I could look at something, like, stare at it, and then draw it, like, realistically. Like, realism, I could stare at a car for a few seconds and then draw it. Or I could stare at the TV or a character on the TV, and my brain would, like, break it up into shapes, and I could draw it. Like, I'm looking, the first time I knew that I could do this, I was watching Chowder.
Purple apples! Oh, I simply love purple apples. Can't you give me 3 samples to a pretty lady?
Sure. Do you know one?
Can't you give a free sample to an ugly lady?
No, ugly ladies have to pay. Hey, ugly! You owe me $300!
And for a split second, I saw the different shapes that were used to build the character. And I was like, wait a minute. And I grabbed a piece of paper, and I drew the shapes that I saw, but I added them together, and it looked like the character on the screen. So when people asked, how did you know, at what point did you know you could do these things? That was the point I knew that I could draw just by looking at something. So I could draw really well, but I would do things repetitively. I was very reactive. He asked me that too. Were you reactive? He also asked me, if someone were to come into my space and move my things, how would I react? And I shook my head. No, I would not like that. Why are you coming into my space and moving my things? And it's a hard no, because everything has a place. Even if it looks cluttered or misplaced, it's there intentionally, because I will remember that it's there. And if you move it, it messes up the whole system. So back to grad school. So this is prior to going to my immersion trip. There was one particular professor who, she asked me for help with something, so I helped her. And I was sitting in the office by myself, and she came in and she was like, oh, I just walked by a bunch of girls and I understand why you wear your headphones now. Okay. So I was like, okay, yeah, that's not why I wear my headphones, but that's a part of why I wear my headphones, because half the time they're talking and they're not talking about anything. So she was looking for a space to do an event, and I mentioned that my sister works at a particular place, and I had called my sister and I had the phone on speaker, but while my sister is talking, I'm responding, but I'm like laughing in the response because I don't like talking on the phone. And she noticed that, and she asked me how old my sister was, and I said, oh, she's younger than me. She's a lot younger than me. And she's like, oh, that's interesting. She sounds a lot older, or she sounds older. And then I don't remember where the conversation turned, but she said that I was awkward, but not like in a mean way. I don't remember how that came up in conversation. But she explained that she said I was awkward because I was laughing while on the phone. And then she also explained that, okay, that's too like a dead giveaway. But she did say something that caused for pause. But I was like, okay, I don't understand why you said that, but I'm not gonna dig too deep into it. But it did. I was like, okay. So that happened. So then we go to Guyana, right? So I didn't want to constantly wear my headphones because that would be interpreted as rude. I wanted to be involved because I wanted to be present in the immersion trip. Like, you're in Guyana, you're traveling with your school, you're doing great work, be present. So I didn't use my headphones. I engaged in a lot of the conversations that were happening. We're in the van, we're like around each other 24/7. I had to share a room. My roommate, she liked to keep the room Arctic temperatures. One night I had a sleep mask on. I sleep with a sleep mask on. It was for lashes, but I just liked having the pressure. So I sleep with a sleep mask on, and she like wakes me up out of my sleep abruptly, saying that she had a nightmare that I jumped out of my sleep on the bed and was screaming like a banshee. So I take my mask off, and she's like freaking out in the corner. I'm like, what's the issue? And she explained the dream she had, and I was like, just turn the light on. So she turns the light on, and then I'm just like, okay, we're cool. She turns the light off. Then we go back to sleep. But we were doing suicide intervention work, so the day was heavy. We get in the van. The conversations are still jumping. People are still talking. We get in the room. She's on the phone. I didn't have a problem with that. It's just like there was no real space for me to decompress and to be without noise, without talking. So I was doing fine. I was doing good. Even prior to getting on the trip, I was telling people in my immediate family and circle, like, oh yeah, I'm sharing a room. And I was open to sharing a room, because even when I was telling my family, like, oh, I'm sharing a room, they were like, they're having you share a room? Like, it never ends good. Why are you sharing a room? But from my perspective, I wanted to challenge myself. I'm not doing that anymore. I'm not sharing any more rooms. No more. So I'm sharing a room. There's constant talking. I'm constantly talking. I'm constantly doing. I'm overstimulated. So I met with the assessment person who did my autism assessment, and I told him that story. And then I told a psychiatrist that story, and they all make the same face. Like, oh, okay. Like, I get it. So eventually, the last night, I just couldn't take it anymore. I hysterically start crying. So unfortunately, I have to hit you with the Disney Channel. Don't go away. Stay tuned for part 2 because it's already long, and I just feel like the Guyana thing, and that was like the pivotal moment in my discovery journey, needs its own video. So I'm going to put that in part 2. So don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. And if you're feeling that you might be neurodiverse or you already know you're neurodiverse, leave a comment down below about your experience and your story and what made you or motivated you to seek out a full-blown diagnosis. Thank you.